In Nebraska, in a gubernatorial race and a Senate race, you've endorsed Ben Sasse and Pete Ricketts in those two races. What does it take for you to be convinced that you've endorsed the right candidate in these races?
Well, sure. I think that's a very good question. All of us, I think, know that where we are in this country right now is at a critical fork in the road. We are facing unprecedented challenges, fiscal and economic challenges, where we've been trapped for 5 years in economic stagnation. We're facing an assault on our constitutional liberties. And in order to turn this country back, we've got to see two things happen. We've got to see, number one, the grassroots rise up, the American people rise up and hold elected officials accountable, hold them accountable to both parties. And number two, we need to have leaders who are willing to stand up and do the right thing, and in particular, take the slings and arrows that come from taking a hard principled stand. And that's why the Nebraska elections today are so important. I've spent a lot of time visiting with both Ben Sasse and Pete Ricketts, getting to know them and looking at their records. And I'm convinced, based on their character, based on their records, that both Ben Sasse and Pete Ricketts are going to be willing to stand up and make the hard choices to turn this country around. And it's a fight all across this country. And so I would encourage everyone listening to the show, come out and vote today. Make your voice heard if you're tired of career politicians in both parties making the problem worse and worse and worse and bankrupting our kids and grandkids. The only way to change it is for the American people to stand up and demand something different.
We had both Ben Sasse and Pete Ricketts on the show yesterday, and Ben said yesterday on the show that he spoke to you for 45 minutes or so before you were satisfied with the kind of candidate he was. When you're asked to be part of these things and endorse people, are there deal-breaker issues that you need to find answers to before you'll throw them your support?
Oh, sure, and it was a lot more extensive discussion than just we sat down in person and visited, but we also spent a lot of time, my team spent a lot of time on the phone with his team, looking at his record, looking at numbers, looking at where the race is, I mean, really trying to delve into the substance. And we did the same thing with Pete Ricketts, where, you know, I have made relatively few endorsements this cycle, and I'm trying to husband them carefully so that if I do wade into a race, I want people to be able to be confident and trust that the person that I'm standing beside is someone who I'm convinced is going to stand up and fight when it's difficult. And you know, that's the most rare quality in politics. It is the quality of fearlessness. It is the willingness. Let's take Ben Sasse in the U.S. Senate. What I think is critical in 2014 is two things. Number one, that Republicans win control of the Senate and retire Harry Reid as majority leader, and I think we're likely to do that. But number two, that we grow the very small core of strong constitutional conservatives by one or two or three people who are willing to stand up to look the party bosses in the eyes and say, I don't work for you, I work for the people of Nebraska. And just one or two or three strong fighters will change the entire nature of the Senate. And the reason I'm supporting Ben, the reason I'm supporting Pete, is because I believe both of them have that courage of conviction to be willing to do so.
Senator Ted Cruz, our guest on Jack and Dave in the Morning at 8:25 here in Lincoln. Senator Cruz, I think a lot of the ideas you talk about probably ring very true to Republicans. There are probably some cynics out there too, though, and that are saying, "Hey, I assume everything in politics is some sort of a quid pro quo. When an endorsement is made, there's got to be something going back to the endorser in this case. Is that happening here? Is it some sort of a payment? Is it some sort of a benefit to a PAC, or is it truly, as you're saying, just you truly respect and believe what these guys are saying?"
It is very much the latter. But listen, the quid pro quo is simple. We've got to turn this country around. And the quid pro quo, I hope, is, and I'm confident in, is that each of these men will stand up and fight for free market principles in the Constitution, will fight to turn the country around. I mean, from my perspective, we need allies in this fight. You know, if you're in the middle of a firefight and you're taking incoming from all sides, you're looking for reinforcements to come in, and the quid pro quo is, help win this battle so we can turn the country around. And that is very much the focus, my focus, and it is, one of the things that is remarkable as I've traveled Texas, I've traveled Nebraska, I've traveled the country, is people are waking up, and they're waking up in extraordinary numbers. They're looking up and realizing what we're doing isn't working. And it's a lot of folks who hadn't been involved in politics. They've been going to work, going to church, raising their kids, and they realize we're bankrupt in this country. Economic growth and jobs have disappeared under President Obama. For 5 years, we've been trapped in the great stagnation, and opportunity for working men and women, for young people, for Hispanics, for African Americans, for single moms is becoming harder and harder to realize. And I'll tell you, I am very encouraged right now because I think where we are today is an awful lot like the late 1970s. The late 1970s, you had Jimmy Carter in the White House. You had the same failed economic policies, out-of-control spending and taxes and regulations, the same economic malaise and misery, and the same feckless and naive foreign policy making the world a much more dangerous place. And what we saw was a grassroots movement of millions of men and women across the country that rose up and became the Reagan Revolution, and it turned this country around. It brought economic growth back. It brought jobs back. It brought opportunity back. It brought America back strong in the world. And the reason I'm optimistic is that I see the same thing happening right now. The same millions of people standing up, waking up, and saying, we've got to fight to save the greatest country in the history of the world. And that gives me optimism, is the men and women across this country who are holding our elected officials in both parties accountable.
Our guest is Senator Ted Cruz, who joins us on Jack and Dave in the morning, 828 at 45 degrees. All right, let me spin a scenario for you. And I don't like to deal in what ifs a lot, but I'd really like to hear about what you perceive the future to be so far as the Senate is concerned. Let's say Ben Sasse does win and is Nebraska's newest senator. But let's say that Mitch McConnell wins too and the Republicans don't take the Senate. Do the Republicans have a plan to come together, or do they have an issue that they can rally around? Because I don't know if we can take 2 more years of what's going on now.
Well, if Republicans don't take the Senate, our ability to stop the president's abuse of power is limited, because as long as Harry Reid controls the Senate, he controls the agenda. He shuts down any oversight. He prevents any oversight into the abuse of power, into the lawlessness, into the executive actions. And he also controls the executive the agenda in terms of the legislative agenda. He controls, which means under Harry Reid's Senate, under the Democratic control of the Senate, he will not allow a vote on the common sense pro-growth policies. The number one priority of Americans across this country is restoring jobs and economic growth. That's my number one priority. I want to get back. From 2008 to 2012, our economy grew 0.9% a year. It's not working. And I can tell you, the year and a half I've been in the Senate, under Harry Reid's Senate, we have spent 0 time even talking about jobs and economic growth. We spent 6 weeks talking about guns and the president's efforts to undermine our Second Amendment right to keep and bear arms, and 0 time talking about fundamental tax reform, about regulatory reform, about repealing Obamacare that's killing millions of jobs, taking away millions of people's health care. And no wonder Congress is at 10, 12, 14% approval rating if the Senate won't even talk about the number one priority for most Americans. So taking control of the Senate is critical. If we don't do so, then the best we can do is try to speak out and highlight these abuses of power. But if we do take control of the Senate, and I think we're likely to do so, I think the terrain is very favorable and the Democratic senators are running scared. If we do take control, then I think next year we will see, number one, the meaningful oversight from the Senate of the president's abuse of power, of his lawlessness, of the regulatory assaults that are hammering small businesses and killing jobs. And I think, number two, the Senate will begin to vote on common sense, pro-growth economic policies to reduce the burdens from the federal governments on small businesses, on people who are struggling, so that we can have more jobs, more opportunity for people like my dad, who 58 years ago fled Cuba with nothing. And he'd been imprisoned, he'd been tortured, and he washed dishes making 50 cents an hour. It's people like my dad washing dishes at 50 cents an hour who have been hammered by the Obama economy. We got to get back to an economy where small businesses are prospering and opportunity is plentiful. And that's what, if and when we take control of the Senate, we can begin to advance policies and have votes on common sense pro-growth policies to turn things around.
Senator Ted Cruz, our guest on Jack and Dave in the Morning. Senator, real quick, I know you're short on time. We really appreciate it. One last question. I'd be remiss if I didn't ask about some of the latest news. I know yesterday Senate Democrats blocked a request from you to approve a resolution supporting the creation of a select Senate committee to investigate Benghazi. You had a list of 10 questions that you say went unanswered, and a lot of them very interesting ones, and it does sound like they need further maybe investigation on this, but there were some who were critical of those questions, saying that they had a political bent to it. Specifically, a question about whether or not President Obama, Secretary Clinton were sleeping on the night of September 11th, 2012, whether they were sleeping when what was going on. Is that the right question to ask? Are your questions political in nature?
Well, I laid out a series of 10 questions that haven't been answered, because the response of the Democrats to the call for a select committee is to complain that there have already been lots of hearings and there's nothing more to be learned. And the problem is, yes, there have been hearings, but the administration, the Democrats, have stonewalled the hearings. They've refused to turn over basic facts. And so I laid out a whole number of the facts that hadn't been answered, one of which is what you said there, which is the basic question: what did President Obama do during the attacks? Was he awake? Was he asleep? I mean, you remember well, we all remember, in 2008 during the Democratic presidential primary, the TV ad that Hillary Clinton ran against Barack Obama, where she had the 3 a.m. phone call, and she asked, will he be ready to answer the 3 a.m. phone call? Well, at 3 a.m., our men were under fire and in mortal risk and ultimately lost their lives, and never once has the White House answered. So we know, for example, the Secretary of Defense, Leon Panetta, he testified before the Armed Services Committee, and he told me, I asked him, did you sleep that night? He said, no, I was at the Pentagon all night dealing with the attack on our men. And I asked, did you speak with the President at all that evening? No, I did not speak with the President once. Did you speak with Secretary of State Hillary Clinton at all that evening? No, I didn't speak with them at all. Do you know if they were awake or asleep? I don't know. It is a relevant question to understand what our leadership did when we've got 4 Americans under terrorist attack, when we have the first ambassador killed in service since 1979. One of the relevant questions that Congress has a responsibility to ask is, what did our leadership do to prevent the attack, to send in military assets to try to save the lives of those brave Americans who were under attack, and then to track down the perpetrators? And I'll tell you, the response was fascinating. So Democratic Senator Bob Menendez, who's the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, objected to my request for a select committee on Benghazi in the Senate, a joint committee. And when I asked him the question, he said, we already know everything we need to know. And so I said, well, you haven't answered any of the 10 questions I put out. For example, was President Obama asleep that night? And that's a yes or no question. It's a very simple question. His response, I thought, was very revealing. Senator Menendez said, I don't know if President Obama was asleep. I don't know if anyone even told President Obama about the terrorist attack that was happening. I don't know if there was anything President Obama could have done to save those American lives. But he said those questions aren't worthy of being answered. And I thought that was a stunning admission, number one, of how little we know, because the administration is stonewalled. If the Democratic chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee in the Senate doesn't know if the president was told or if he could have acted to stop it, we have a lot of questions that need to be answered, and we owe an obligation to the men and women who are serving our nation across the world, who are risking their lives on the front line, to find out what happened, to find out what mistakes were made, to find out what we can do to prevent future attacks, and to do everything we can to apprehend or kill the terrorists. It's been 20 months with 4 dead Americans and 0 dead terrorists, and I think that's unacceptable. That's not consistent with the obligation we have to the American people.
And I'm sure you'll stay on top of the issue. Senator, we want to thank you so much for joining us on a busy election day, and I'm sure you'll be watching Nebraska with bated breath tonight. And an open invitation to come back to Jack and Dave in the morning anytime you want.
I appreciate it. Thank you for having me, and let me again encourage all of your listeners, please come out and vote today in Nebraska, and I would respectfully suggest and recommend that you support Ben Sasse for Senate and Pete Ricketts for governor. I think both are good men and strong conservatives who will stand up and do the right thing when it's difficult to do so and when it matters.
There we go. Senator Ted Cruz from Texas, we appreciate your time, sir.